separate pork primals based on some of those quality parameters that we think would be meaningful. So maybe color, marbling, firmness, pH level. And the data would suggest that that doesn't necessarily determine or attribute to variation that we would see in terms of eating experience. That's not to say that those parameters aren't important. There's just not as much of a direct connection between quality parameters and eating experience with pork. And the reason that I mention that is because that creates a lot of challenges for the industry in terms of, what does the industry want to market in terms of high quality pork that's gonna make sure the consumer has a positive eating experience.
Swine.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Swine podcast. I'm Dr. 𝗟𝗶𝘀𝗃𝗀, and today I have as my guest Dr. Ben Bohrer. Dr. Bohrer is an assistant professor in meat science and muscle biology at The Ohio State University. Welcome to our show, Dr. Bohrer.
Thanks. It's great to be on.
Great. Well, I'm so glad you could join us today. And so I'd like for you to give us a little introduction about yourself and just tell us about your career path, how you got where you are today to start us off.
Yeah. So I'm at Ohio State, as you mentioned. I guess but kind of everything came full circle, and I actually started my academic time at Ohio State as an undergraduate student. Born and raised in Ohio. So I did my undergrad and my master's here at Ohio State, and then I did my PhD at the University of Illinois. And it was really at the University of Illinois where I began learning about a lot of the things that we'll talk about today. So pork quality, pig production, those type of things. So after I finished my PhD working with Dr. Dustin Bohrer and Dr. Anna Dilger at the University of Illinois, I started my career actually in Canada at the University of Guelph, and I was hired there as a faculty member focusing on meat processing. So I was in their Department of Food Science, and for those of you that may not be familiar with the University of Guelph, it's really thought of as Canadians' agricultural university. It houses the Ontario Agricultural College, and a lot of the university there is focused towards food. I guess not all not just animal-derived food products, but food products and a lot of different forms. So I got a lot of exposure there to kind of the larger field of food science. I spent 4 years there before having the opportunity to move back to Ohio State in my current position. And I've actually been here for about 4 years. So it seems like I've been multiple different places about an equal amount of time at this point. At Ohio State, I have a teaching and research appointment, about 2/3 research, about 1/3 teaching. So I get the opportunity to mentor graduate students. I also get the opportunity to teach in the classroom. One of the classes I'm teaching this semester is around 110 students, so one of the largest classes in our department here. But really enjoy all aspects of my career right now, and really excited to talk to you today.
We have a time and labor-saving product for you. 𝗟𝗏𝗀𝗃 by Healthy Farms is your solution. No more lugging jugs around the barn every month. With 𝗟𝗏𝗀𝗃, you simply drop the slat through the floor twice a year, and it works to break down solids, reduces crusting and forming. To learn more, visit myhealthyfarms.com.
Great. Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. It's great to hear from our guests sort of their life experiences and where they got to being on our show talking about pork. So, Dr. Bohrer, one of your areas of study is the eating experience or perception of pork quality eating. So let's talk about that a little bit. Share with us what you've been working on.
Yeah, so I guess we'll start at really the I guess the front end in terms of what determines a positive eating experience of pork products. So typically, as meat scientists, you're going to hear the term meat palatability, and what we mean by that is tenderness, juiciness, and flavor of the product, or all things that kind of describe how a consumer perceives a fresh meat product. But in terms of how we get there, it can really be you know very I guess complex in terms of what determines those three palatability parameters. Usually we think, some of the variation that we would see with different products is attributed to the individual animal. So maybe the genetic makeup or how that animal was managed. One of the other things that could determine, an eating experience is what cut that you're eating. So if we're eating a loin chop, or maybe if we're eating a tenderloin, those are going to have very different eating experiences or attributes from a sensory standpoint. And then the final two things would be really how we, as processors, either age or store the product. So if we allow it time to develop uh, some post-mortem proteolysis, and we actually make the product more tender. And then finally, the last thing that oftentimes gets overlooked, but I think over the last 10 or 15 years, a lot of this has been a lot of research has kind of helped the industry. But the fourth thing would be final preparation, or how the product's been cooked. So you'll see National Pork Board recently lowered their endpoint cooking temperature of pork products to 145 degrees Fahrenheit, or 63 degrees Celsius, and that's to improve the eating experience of the product. It has major impacts on juiciness, as well as tenderness. So I think those four things really describe, eating experience and variation in terms of eating experience. So animal muscle cut, how the product's been aged, and then final preparation of the product. But sometimes as meat scientists, and really as an industry, the question may not be exactly, what's determining or what's attributing to variation in eating quality, but the connection between, visual aspects of a meat cut, and how we could use those to help predict eating experience. And that's typically what we would refer to as pork quality, or pork quality parameters. So we could measure things like color, marbling, firmness of the product. We can also, use instrumental means. So we could use something like a pH meter, or other instruments, whether we're using near infrared or visual light spectrums. Those can sometimes be useful in predicting some of these parameters. But that in a nutshell is a lot of the things that I'm interested in from a research standpoint.
No, great. That's really interesting. One thing that came up in my mind as you were talking is how is the connection between what you're working on and, let's say, the companies producing the pork, or we could start with perhaps the processing plant, right? We'll start there as opposed to the producer, because there's some vertically integrated and some not. But what's a collaboration, because you're working on these meat attributes, but they're selling it, right? So how's that work?
Yeah, so it's kind of it's definitely, I mean, and I think of, because I work with both the pork industry as well as the beef industry on different projects. And the beef industry has a uh, very nice grading system that they use. And the reason that grading system exists, and the reason why it works so well, is that if we look at different grades of beef, and then we do consumer testing or trained sensory testing, those grades very much determine eating experience or eating satisfaction. So if we have, a prime beef steak versus a choice or select beef steak, chances of us having a good eating experience is much higher with the prime steak versus a lower quality grade steak. That's not necessarily how it works in pork. So we could, separate pork primals based on some of those quality parameters that we think would be meaningful. So maybe color, marbling, firmness, pH level. And the data would suggest that doesn't necessarily determine or attribute to variation that we would see in terms of eating experience. That's not to say that those parameters aren't important. There's just not as much of a direct connection between quality parameters and eating experience with pork. And the reason that I mention that is because that creates a lot of challenges for the industry in terms of, what does the industry want to market in terms of high quality pork that's gonna make sure the consumer has a positive eating experience. Is it darker pork? Is it lighter colored pork? Is it heavily marbled pork? Maybe not so heavily marbled pork. And that's one of the major challenges I guess in my mind, from a research standpoint, in terms of where do we go with pork quality, because a lot of those attributes that we once thought were important have been proven to maybe not be quite as important. So I think that that's one thing to bring up. And I guess from my research and maybe things that I'm interested in moving forward, I mentioned those four things earlier. So the animal, the muscle cut, aging, and final preparation. I think a lot of research has been conducted in terms of final preparation, and we have enough evidence to support a lower endpoint cooking temperature is attributed to a more positive eating experience. But I think in terms of those other parameters, muscle cut's something that we largely don't know a lot of information about. We don't necessarily know how, maybe a muscle or a cut that's coming from the ham or maybe the shoulder. How could those be used as fresh meat cuts? The industry hasn't traditionally really ventured out beyond just the loin or maybe the tenderloin in terms of fresh meat cuts. So there may be some advantages there from a flavor standpoint. Or maybe from maybe a water holding capacity standpoint that would be attributed to juiciness. That's really one of the things I'm really interested in comparing would be different muscle cuts throughout the pork carcass with intentions of using those as fresh meat cuts.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting topic, because I think the variability of, at least in my experience, the taste of, ham versus a shoulder is quite different. And, is that because of the preparation that we do different, or is it just the taste of that muscle itself that is to be quite variable?
Yeah.
So how do you go about researching that area? So let's dig in just a little bit about, some of the ways you're looking into that area, or ideas for, future research.
Yeah, so one research study that we had published recently stems from a project that we worked with Ontario Pork as well as a pork processor in Canada. And what we did is we were already, for part of the project, fabricating the carcass into a fat-free lean. So we were really dissecting each of the individual cuts and separating lean from fat. And that provided a good opportunity for us to maybe dig in and look at some of these different muscles throughout the pork carcass. And what we ended up doing in that study was just simply measuring pH and instrumental color of 9 different muscles throughout the pork carcass. And we had a population of around 360 carcasses for this study. And what we found with that study is that the loin, compared to 6 muscles in the ham and 2 muscles in the shoulder, was the lightest in terms of its color and the lowest in terms of its pH. So we would maybe think that maybe that's the lowest quality cut of all the different muscles that we measured in this particular study. And then the other thing that was interesting is whenever we ran regression analysis and particularly looked at prediction equations, quality parameters of the loin were not indicative of quality parameters of the ham or the shoulder within the same pork carcass. So we may be able to look at the loin and think, oh, that's a really high quality loin. We're going to make the assumption that it's also the cuts coming from the shoulder. The ham may also be really high quality, but that really wasn't the case. So we had really low R square values, and that's not a good assumption to make, which again convolutes kind of the idea that maybe we could use one muscle cut to determine quality of the entire carcass. It didn't seem like that was really the case, which maybe we would expect based on uh, maybe how that carcass is chilling or maybe different things that's happening from a processing standpoint. But it was a little bit surprising to us that there really was no relationship between quality of the different muscles.
So do you think that would make the genetics part of that, the 4 pieces fairly difficult if that holds true?
Yeah, it would make it so that variation attributed to individual animal would be very difficult to really pinpoint. And I think that that's something that certainly warrants further investigation. And again, that's one of the challenges for the last 20 or 30 years. Most of the time, whenever we've made management changes or maybe changed genetics or improved genetics, we're just looking at loin quality and really haven't investigated quality of any other muscles throughout the carcass.
Yeah, that's interesting. So let's do a segue with beef. So would that be consistent with beef that a prime would be several cuts of that beef animal, different than pork?
So I think that most studies in beef, and again, I'd have to dig into the research and the literature a little bit deeper, but I think that most of the time we would assume that, if we have a prime grade beef carcass that's evaluated at the 12th, 13th rib intersection at the grading site, that we're also going to have higher quality cuts in maybe the round or the shoulder. And the reason why is that is largely attributed to marbling. And if we're at the prime level with marbling, then that's around 10 to 12% intramuscular fat. Where if we're at 10 to 12% intramuscular fat on a pork loin, then we've just seen what I'd refer to as a unicorn. It's something that we just don't see in the pork industry very often. So that's one of the challenges, is that if we want to use marbling as a quality parameter in the pork industry, we have to realize that at the most we're probably at 3 or 4% intramuscular fat. So if we're going to compare that back to beef, we're probably comparing what would be like a low select USDA grade, maybe versus a high select USDA grade. So we're really not meeting that threshold in terms of marbling to really use any of the same metrics that we would use with beef, or the same level of assumptions we would use with beef in the pork industry, or at least that would be my viewpoint.
Wow, I never thought about that part of it. It sounds like meat science is as hard as vet science when it comes to the pig and pork, in terms of being complicated. So, well, that's interesting. What do you have as kind of like the the biggest challenge that you think pork has? We already talked about this grading system that
Mhm.
we, kind of don't have a systematic way, and that may be because it's not quite that easy. What's the
Yeah.
biggest challenge do you think? Do you see pork having over other meat proteins?
I think the biggest challenge that pork has is that when we get beyond the belly primal, which we're using for bacon production, it's trying to drive demand for the rest of the pork carcass, whether that be the loin, the ham, or the shoulder. Um, those products and the end products made from those different primals aren't highly sought after by most consumers. So trying to either position pork as a commodity like poultry, or trying to improve quality and try to rival beef in some instances for the center of the plate protein. So that's one of the challenges I think that the pork industry, or I guess at least from a pork standpoint, that the industry is facing. Whether we want to go more of a commodity type of a route and worry more about lean to fat ratio and convenience of products, and using our products as kind of a blank canvas where we can add sauces or different ingredients and make it more of like a poultry type of product, or if we want to try to rival beef. And that's something that, as an industry, I think we've struggled with for quite some time, and we really have been stuck in between two proteins that are, I would say, more direction focused in terms of what their main objectives are in terms of the beef and poultry. So that would be my biggest challenge facing the pork industry, and I wish I knew exactly what direction the industry should head, but I think that it gets pretty challenging whenever we begin thinking about that as well.
Yeah, I've always wondered, my personal, well, okay, beyond bacon, of course, I love bacon, but in terms of cuts, I've always wondered why we don't see more pork shoulder. Now we have it in barbecue, and everybody tends to have
Yeah.
this pastime that they want to smoke a pork butt when getting ready for a football game, so to speak. But in restaurants or in food service or fast food, you just don't see pork shoulder. But yet, personally, I think it's a great cut of meat.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree, and there's also, if we're thinking back to really changes in the industry, pork carcasses continue to get heavier, continue to get bigger. So there would be, I think, maybe some advantages or opportunities to bigger pork carcasses with making some of those muscle cuts a little bit larger in terms of their size. That would improve their marketability, because that is one challenge. I know I was actually working on a project this morning where we were looking at specific muscles in the shoulder and in the ham, and we were trying to capture as many pieces as we could for analysis. And some of those muscle cuts are just pretty small, and there's just not a lot there to work with in terms of trying to make a product, or even from my standpoint as a researcher, trying to get enough sample to actually make a meaningful analysis of a particular muscle.
Well, because I don't talk to very many people in the meat protein space, I have a question, a little bit different type of question. What do you think about plant-based protein as a threat to meat protein?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I wrote a review paper on this a few years ago, just looking at at that time just the macronutrient content of plant-based meat analogs, and what we referred to were modern day plant-based meat analogs, so products that are directly trying to simulate what a meat product would be. So, I don't want to throw any names out there, but the products that have really emerged in the last 5 years at grocery stores, at some fast food restaurants, and from a macronutrient standpoint, they're pretty close to being there in terms of protein content. They're a little bit higher in terms of their sodium content, a little bit higher in terms of their dietary fiber content. But they're pretty close in terms of nutrient specs, is what we would see with ground beef and pork products. I think the biggest challenge with those products would be uh, the repeat purchase by consumers. I think a lot of consumers have spoken with their decisions at the grocery store or at a fast food restaurant over the last 2 or 3 years, and we've seen some of those modern meat analog products really plummet in terms of sales, or plummet in terms of their stock prices because of that. I think a lot of people thought, I'm going to try these products, new, innovative, kind of cool from a social standpoint. But what we're seeing as an industry is that consumers aren't repurchasing those products. They're going back to consuming traditional meat products. So that's encouraging for the meat industry, or at least the animal protein industry, to kind of see that they're coming back to traditional meat products. But I think it also provides a lot of opportunities for plant-based meat analog companies to make improvements to their products. It's kind of an ongoing process. It gets me kind of excited from a food science standpoint to get to work with new and innovative ingredients. Sometimes we can even think about ingredients that we could add that may add value from a nutrition and health standpoint, but those would be isolated to maybe adding dietary fiber, and making those products higher fiber, or maybe adding maybe antioxidants or pro-oxidants or something like that may help with human health and those type of things, which is probably a conversation to have on its own. One of the other things that's I think's emerging, and we're going to continue to see emerge, that's kind of along the same line of plant-based meat analogs, would be cellular agriculture and cellular-based meat products. So growing meat products in a laboratory setting where we're feeding cultures and growing meat that way. I think that that's something that it's not going to replace animal agriculture by any means, but it may be something that will fill a niche for some consumers, and it'll be interesting with those products in terms of are the muscle tissues we're working with, will they behave the same way whenever we start processing those tissues? Will they accept some of the processing techniques that we have traditionally used in the meat industry? And I think that that's an aspect that'll be really interesting from a science standpoint.
Yeah, you took my next lead. My next question was going to be lab derived, meat as a threat or challenge. On that topic, I had a question about: are you familiar with the product that's gotten all the way to the cooking? Is there a preparation, or do you cook that meat the same? And does that is it different?
That is a great question. So I haven't been able to actually work directly with meat that's been grown in that way yet. I'm excited to in the future. One of the things that I think would be really interesting, we work with those we may work with those products, but are we going to make traditional meat products with that meat tissue? Are we going to make things like maybe hot dogs or lunch meats with those? And if we do, can we use the same type of ingredients that we have historically, or do we need to use a new set of ingredients? If are salts going to work in the same manner? Are antioxidants going to work in the same manner? Are functional ingredients like phosphates going to work in the same manner? That's something that I think will be really interesting, because again, if those meat products haven't aren't coming from live animals, then maybe some of the functions that we've always thought works with muscle tissues from a processing standpoint, maybe they're not going to work in the same manner. And then you mentioned about final preparation. Um, I would assume that endpoint cooking temperature, those type of things will work in a very similar manner. But again, I don't know if we've necessarily tested that to this point. So that's another great question.
Yeah, interesting. Of course, I have a personal bias over the live animal, since that's where I've spent my career. But I think it's intriguing as we understand the need for protein, right, in our population, and the impact. So really neat area. So there's another area that you've been working in that I want to jump to for just a bit of time, and that's the 𝗟𝗶𝘀 product, and kind of its role, or consumer perception, or that area of using that product. So really quick for our listeners and for me, could you just cover a little bit of what 𝗟𝗶𝘀 is, and then we can go into the area of consumer perception.
Yeah, so 𝗟𝗻 is it's a product that works as a immunological suppression of either testicular function or ovarian activity, whether we're dealing with male pigs or female pigs. And it's approved for use in most countries throughout the world for both male and female pigs. It's being adopted at varying levels of success in different countries. I work primarily with the Canadian group on the 𝗟𝗻 product, and some of the customers that have adopted the product in Canada have really done so because while it's not a label claim for the production advantages, but it does offer pretty significant production advantages for male pigs and female pigs. So we can think specifically with male pigs, we're seeing improvements of feed efficiency of 8 to 12%, and that's attributed to growing that pig as an entire male or as a boar for most of his life, and then suppressing testicular function towards the end of life, 4 to 10 weeks before harvest. And then with the female pig, what we're actually seeing is differences in terms of appetite, particularly towards the end of the finishing phase, where that female pig is beginning to experience estrus, If we stop ovarian activity from happening, she's no longer, directing some of her nutrients to reproductive tract growth. She's also more interested in spending time at the feeder, so she grows somewhere in the ballpark of 3 to 6% faster in terms of average daily gain, which would result in a heavier carcass weight for the female pig. One of the things that's really interesting with the female pig is uh, narrowing the gap in terms of variation in hot carcass weight. So we're able to get much uniform groups of pigs to market by eliminating those really slow growing gilts that are usually hanging around whenever we're doing the barn dump and maybe don't quite make it to the spot that we want to on a marketing grid from a weight basis. So a really exciting product. It hasn't really been adopted um, in the U.S. for a variety of different reasons. But it is a product that is approved for export to most countries throughout the world, if not all countries that I'm aware of. And it's a product that has both production advantages as well as advantages on the meat quality side of the spectrum, and on the processing side of the spectrum.
So, in terms of efficiency, so the pig grows faster or with less input, so to speak. What does it do on the meat quality? Let's just does it produce a leaner product then, or do you have to feed the animal different to accommodate that?
Yeah, so a couple things there. So the first thing is in terms of nutrients that you need to change in terms of your diets. So you do need to change your diets to the nutrient specifications of an entire male growing pig. So that would be increasing protein content by maybe 15 to 20%, and that's attributed to lower feed intake. But from a meat quality standpoint, we do see advantages and different advantages for both the male and the female. So the male, it's been shown with a meta-analysis that was published by the University of Illinois in 2017, that you get an improvement in terms of carcass cutting yields. That's around the range of 1.25 percentage units. So you do get a leaner, higher cutability male pig. And then from the female side of the spectrum, you get a heavier carcass, but also one that is more uniform in terms of its fat content across a population. And we would eliminate some of those extremely trim gilts and probably get to a more acceptable level of fat thickness. And then another aspect of that, not to get into too much detail, but from a fat quality standpoint, there are improvements in terms of fat quality for the female, where we see a reduction in terms of iodine value of 2 to 3 iodine value units. So a pretty substantial improvement in terms of fat quality with the female pig. No difference in terms of iodine value for the male pig compared to a castrated barrel.
That's interesting. So on the male pig, because it's a better yield and a leaner animal, does it affect the meat quality? The tasting of that pork.
So it will lower marbling content by around 1/3 of a marbling score unit, or 1/3 of a unit in terms of the subjective marbling score. So there is a little bit less marbling. There's also a little bit less fat thickness. So probably around a 10% reduction in terms of fat thickness. So that it is a leaner animal. All of the studies that have been conducted looking at sensory quality between uh, male pigs managed with 𝗿𝗺 versus physically castrated male pigs would indicate that there's no differences from a tenderness, juiciness, and flavor standpoint.
Okay. And then it sounds like on the female there might be some advantages in terms of the fat versus an animal not given and progressed.
Certainly. And I guess one of the things I probably should have mentioned earlier is the conversation we've been having here would be comparing pigs managed with 𝗿𝗺 versus kind of the standard that we'd see in North America, so physical castration, and then just gilts that are experiencing ovarian activity during the finishing period. That's not the case in all countries where 𝗿𝗺vest has been adopted. So, if we look at countries like Australia, or maybe some countries in Europe, or maybe countries in South America, where maybe that entire male or that boar pig would be the standard, and managing those male pigs with 𝗿𝗺vest offers several advantages from a meat quality standpoint, where we're eliminating, or I guess eliminating wouldn't be the correct term to use there, but we're getting boar taint to a level that we would see with physically castrated males. So we're improving meat quality quite a bit in those systems.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's an age, right? To you have a much higher level of those products the older the pig gets, and so you could take that carcass weight up, and really change the economics, right, in that type of system.
Yeah, and that's been one of the interesting things as we've seen the market share grow in Canada, as that really being one of the first countries that have adopted 𝗿𝗺vest on a widespread level, where the standard would be that physically castrated male pig. And most other countries that have adopted 𝗿𝗺vest, that standard or the alternative to not using 𝗿𝗺vest is raising entire male pigs. And you're dealing with, boar taint that's affecting probably 40% or so of those male pigs. So really off-putting to some consumers. It's not maybe affecting all consumers, and it's not affecting maybe all pigs at a threshold level that would be high enough for those boar taint compounds. But it's really something to think about. And one of the other things I talk with, several different influential people in the swine industry in terms of what's going to happen in the future with regulations with castration, and maybe where the industry would head if we see more limitations or more restrictions in terms of being able to physically castrate pigs the same way that we have for many decades.
Yeah, I think there's there's a whole program or maybe series of those to talk about on the welfare side of products like that, and just those management practices, but on both sides, right? Because leaving males intact, you can get some fighting, and some riding, and some behavioral things that also impact welfare, and so it's a balance, and finding the right thing for raising the pig the best way is kind of our challenge.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. So, well, very good, very interesting. As we're kind of rounding out our time together, but before we get to kind of the three questions that we ask all of our guests, I want to ask you to share with us, just some take homes, or maybe something that we didn't touch on today for the audience. What do you think are the main keys that you want to leave us with after this conversation?
Well, I don't have probably a lot in terms of what we had discussed today, but I would encourage any listener out there, go out and buy pork, and follow the guidelines in terms of how to cook and prepare that pork product, and really think about ways that pork product may have some good aspects from an equality standpoint, or maybe things that you'd like to see improved. And if you have issues with the pork product that's on your plate, chances are the average consumer is also maybe seeing some things where areas that could be improved. So I think that's really where it starts, because whatever aspect of the pork industry you're interested in, if we're letting down the end consumer with our products, then that's something that everybody should really be concerned with, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think good advice.
It's time for our famous three. Why risk it? Your herd may have antigenic gaps that are not being covered by the products currently available. Custom-made vaccines provide a unique advantage in that they can be formulated to a herd's specific bacterial and viral needs. Choose the exact isolates, adjuvant, packaging, and size you need with Vaccinova for a vaccine formulated to your needs. Find out more by visiting us at vaccinova.us.com. That's VAXXINOVA.us.com.
All right. So now we'll jump into our 3 questions. And this is, so we get to know you a little bit more personally instead of just your scientific research that you've been working on. So what's your favorite book or resource that you use in your area of expertise? So, it could be in the meat science or any of your professional career.
That's a really good question. So I think last time that I did this, I stated the meat buyer's guide. So that's where all the meat cuts are. That whenever we're in the processing room, looking at meat cuts, I use that book a lot. I also use a variety of different meat science textbooks. So there's a textbook called The Meat That We Eat. That's a pretty good textbook. So I would say that those would really be good resources. And then obviously I'm not a nutritionist at all, but the 𝗟𝗏𝗏 is a book that I think is pretty useful and pretty valuable for most people involved with swine production.
Right. So how about a resource or a book outside of ag or outside of your career?
Yeah, so I have a 1-year-old son at home, so it's most of the time if I'm reading at home, it's a children's book to him. But in terms of books that I like to read, so I've really been getting into history and that type of genre. So right now I'm reading a book called The Chancellor that talks about Angela Merkel, the chancellor of, or I guess at this point, previous chancellor of Germany, and I think that's really interesting. She started as a chemist, and then kind of got into politics a little bit later in life, and I think I've really enjoyed that book so far over the last couple weeks when I've been reading it.
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't thought about her in a while, but as a scientist, and then being a diplomat in a country at her position, and personally also a female, I'll put that one on my list. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So the last one that I have for you is share with us an attribute or characteristic that you feel sets apart a successful professional from others. And I think this is good because you're young in your career and you mentor a lot of students. And so I'm interested in this particularly from you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think in most situations, trying to find ways to motivate graduate students takes a lot of persistence. It takes a lot of consistency in terms of how you interact from day to day. So those would be 2 attributes that I think make somebody successful. Also, I think that being flexible. So I'm not an extremely rigid person when it comes to trying to instruct or lead graduate students. And I think that those would be things that or I guess attributes that I would usually seek out in terms of people that I want to work with and people that I've interacted with that I think are successful. So flexibility, consistency, persistence, determination, all of those type of things.
Yeah, I think those are great. And having worked with a lot of young veterinarians later in my career, I think as we work with really maybe our younger generation, those are going to be important. Yeah, good. Well, thank you so much for being our guest. Again, this is Dr. Ben Bohrer. He's with the Ohio State University, and hopefully you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
All right.